Starting with number 10. The polite German cannibal. Armin Meiwes is a German man who became known as the Rotenburg cannibal or the polite cannibal after murdering and eating a man he met online. Meiwes had been looking for a willing victim for years before coming across Bernd Jürgen Brandes, a man who was willing to be killed and eaten. The two men met at Mew's house, where Brandes agreed to have Meiwes cut off his penis and eat it. Meiwes then killed and ate Brandes over a period of months. Meiwes was apprehended and sentenced to life in prison. Number 9. The Killer Cop. Gerard John Schaefer Jr. was an American serial killer and murderer known as the Killer Cop, Hangman, and Butcher of Blind Creek. At the time of his initial arrest, Schaefer was a sheriff's deputy in Martin County, Florida, which is how he earned the moniker Killer Cop. Schaefer was convicted in 1972 of murdering and mutilating two teenage girls in Port St. Lucie, Florida, and is suspected of up to 26 additional murders. He was known as the Hangman because he was fond of tying restrained women to trees with a hangman's noose around their necks before torturing and murdering them. He was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of the Fort Lauderdale teens, which were his only homicide convictions. He was, however, identified as a possible suspect in up to 30 murders dating back to 1969. Schaefer was also named as a possible suspect in the case of a Florida Jane Doe who was identified nearly 48 years later. Schaefer was stabbed to death in December 1995 by a fellow inmate at the Florida State Prison, a fitting end to his gruesome career. Number 8. The Bloody Benders. From May 1871 to December 1872, the Bender family, also known as the Bloody Benders, was a family of serial killers in Labette County, Kansas, United States. John Bender, his wife Elvira, or Almira, their son John Jr., and their daughter Kate made up the family. But the Benders weren't really a family. The only blood relatives were Ma and Kate. The Benders were notorious for luring travelers to their inn, where they would murder them and bury their bodies. When a group of vigilantes searched their property and discovered the evidence, the game was over. Between 1870 and 1873, the Benders were accused of 11 murders. However, they were never caught. Number 7. The Dnipropetrovsk Maniacs. The Dnipropetrovsk Maniacs were two Ukrainian serial killers who committed a series of murders in Dnipropetrovsk, in June and July 2007. The Maniacs were two locals, Viktor Sayenko and Igor Saprunyuk, both 19 years old. They were charged with 21 murders and found guilty of premeditated murder and cruelty to animals. The victims of the Dnipropetrovsk Maniacs were mostly women, but men and children were also among them. And they decided to film some of their murders, with one of the videos leaking on the internet. Sayenko and Saprunyuk received life sentences for their crimes. Number 6. The Monster of Miramichi. Alan Joseph Leger, also known as the Monster of Miramichi, was a Canadian serial killer, rapist, and arsonist. He was found guilty of 5 counts of murder, arson, and rape. On June 21, 1986, Leger murdered John Glendenning, a store owner in the town of Newcastle, New Brunswick. On May 29, 1989, he murdered Annie Flam and assaulted Flam's sister. On October 13th, he murdered sisters Linda and Donna Donnie. Before leaving, Leger set fire to the Donnie house. Finally, on November 16th, he assassinated Father James Smith. Leger was apprehended a few days later, on November 24th, and died in custody in 2015 at the age of 67. Number 5. The Toy Box Killer. David Parker Ray, also known as the Toy Box Killer, was a serial killer and rapist in the United States during the 1990s. Ray was found guilty of kidnapping, rape, and torture, and he was suspected of murdering several women. His crimes were particularly heinous, and he is infamous for constructing a soundproof torture chamber in a trailer on his property, which he referred to as his toy box. Ray kidnapped women and took them to his torture chamber, where he raped and tortured them for days or weeks at a time. His victims were frequently drugged and tortured, including electric shocks, beatings, and sexual abuse. Ray was apprehended in 1999 after one of his victims escaped and reported him to the police. Cindy Hendy and Roy Yancey, his accomplices, were also convicted for their roles in his crimes. Number 4. The Fritzl Father. The Fritzl case is about Joseph Fritzl, an Austrian man who imprisoned and sexually abused his daughter Elizabeth for 24 years. When his daughter, Elizabeth, was 11, Joseph Fritzl began sexually abusing her. Fritzl lured Elizabeth into the basement of their family home in 1984, when she was 18 years old, and drugged and imprisoned her in a soundproofed room he had built. He raped and sexually abused Elizabeth on numerous occasions, and she bore 7 children, one of whom died shortly after birth. Fritzl's crimes were discovered when one of Elizabeth's children became seriously ill and needed to be hospitalized in 2008. When they apprehended Fritzl, they charged him with rape, incest, false imprisonment, and murder by negligence. Number 3. White Boy Rick. Richard Wersch Jr., also known as White Boy Rick, is a former drug dealer who also served as an FBI informant. Wersch was recruited as an FBI informant at the age of 14 and assisted in the downfall of a corrupt ring of Detroit cops and a string of gang members. Wersch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 1988 for drug trafficking. Wersch claims that the FBI and Detroit police trained him to be a drug informant and then betrayed him when he was arrested for cocaine possession. Wersch has been working to clear his name and was released in 2020 after serving 32 years in prison. Wersch's story has sparked a debate over the harshness of drug laws in the United States and the use of juveniles as informants. Number 2. The Toronto Killer. Between 2010 and 2017, Bruce McArthur was a Canadian serial killer who murdered 8 men in Toronto's gay village. McArthur was a self-employed landscaper and former mall Santa Claus. On January 18, 2018, he was arrested and charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. On January 29, 2019, McArthur pleaded guilty to all 8 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. His victims were mostly Middle Eastern or South Asian immigrants, many of whom were members of Toronto's LGBTQ+ community. Number 1. The Hinterkaifeck Murders. The Hinterkaifeck murders occurred on March 31, 1922, when 6 people of a small Bavarian village north of Munich, Germany, were murdered with a pickaxe. On April 4, 1922, the killings were discovered after neighbors became concerned after not seeing the family for several days. After the murders, the killers stayed on the farm for quite some time, feeding the cattle and eating food from the pantry. Investigators concluded that robbery was not the motive. Despite the fact that dozens of suspects were interviewed, no one has ever been charged with the murders. The Hinterkaifeck property was dismantled the following year, and the Grubers were buried in a local cemetery minus their heads, which had been lost during World War II. The case was reopened multiple times until being sent to the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy as a cold case in 2007. Subscribe for more interesting videos. Bye.